From Vassar College, this is Conversations at the Salt Line.
On this episode, a conversation with Jonathan Carl.
Hey everyone, it's me, Wes, and welcome to another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. Today, I'm here with one of Vassar's finest, class of 1990, Jonathan Caro, who is at ABC News and the author of 3 best-selling books. We're here to talk about one of them today. Thank you for being here, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. So I understand, well, I should say actually, you should be happy because I don't think I have had any guests from the 1990 class on the podcast before. 91 has many sort of oversubscribed, but 90, I
Yeah.
don't think I've had any. So you're the first from your class to be on the podcast.
I can make a few suggestions if you're looking for some follow-ons from the
Please,
1990 class.
please
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
Send me a note afterwards. I want to
yeah,
make sure
for
it's
sure.
equitable across the classes. But happy to have you. And I understand that when you were at Vassar, you studied sociology. Is that true?
Absolutely. I was a sociology major. Yes.
So obviously, I have to ask you, I mean, we're living in incredibly different and unique times. So as a sociology major from some decades ago, I'm curious sort of, I'll ask you about the moment in a second, but thinking back to your time at Vassar, what is a class that you took and a professor you had that really was memorable for you and sort of defined your sociological experience as a Vassar student?
Uh, Look, I had a tremendous experience as a sociology major. Jim and Sandra Forganis were really influential professors to me, and reading the real social theory, reading Max Weber, Durkheim, and all of it quite timely. I have to give I mention another professor outside of the
Mm.
department though that remains. He's no longer, unfortunately, with us, but Walter Fairservice. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you, but he
Yeah.
was an absolute legend on the Vassar campus. He was in the anthropology department, and he
Mm.
taught a class called Comparative Worldviews, which was sweeping in its discussion of, the major themes of civilization going back, a couple thousand years, and then coming up. I think the most recent thing was the that we read in that class was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And Walter Fairservice was rumored to be the guy that Indiana Jones was based on, because he was also a very accomplished archaeologist. And
Wow.
that guy, he gave us this audacious reading list. I mean, it was just absolutely insane
Yeah.
how much reading we had to do. But then every Friday, we were to break up into groups of 4 or 5 and to have discussions spread out all over campus. And this guy, I
Mm.
don't know how he did it. He was an older professor. This was like right before he retired. He would visit all of us. Now, I did my meetings mostly out at the townhouses. Others
Okay.
were in the TAs. Others were in various dorms. And somehow during the course of the 90 minutes of that class, he didn't drive. Well, I don't, maybe he flew. I don't know if he had but anyway, but a brilliant, amazing guy that I think about a lot.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. And I think one other thing I've heard about your Vassar experience was you served as editor-in-chief of The Spectator, which
Yeah.
is sort of I should say, more conservative, I guess, student paper than the Misc. And I'm just curious, given both your experiences at Vassar, but also your experience in the world sort of since, what do you make of our current sort of political or social dialogue about higher education, particularly the claim that places like Vassar are too ideologically homogenous. You've sort of been at Vassar, you are in the
Yeah.
world. I'm just curious what you make of that conversation today.
Look, I think there is something to the critique. When I became editor of the Vassar Spectator, the motto for the Spectator, the slogan was the Journal of Neglected Ideas,
Mm.
and it was certainly the conservative paper on campus. But I took very much to heart the idea of it being a place where ideas could be debated and discussed, and people wouldn't be judged or silenced for having controversial views. So it wasn't strictly, it wasn't a really politically left or right. It was really meant to be that marketplace of ideas. And look, I think that there had been as far back, and this is 1990, so this is ancient history. Forgive me, but but even back then, there were few places for for people who had more conservative views. I think my freshman year there was actually a Republican, a college Republicans club, but I don't think it existed after my freshman year. I'm not sure it would have had, much of a membership. But look, where we are now is really frightening, to see the federal government using its power to try to influence what happens on college campuses. I mean, I was a huge advocate as a student of the idea of freedom of speech, academic freedom, and but to see where we are now, where it's not just a matter of what is going on campus, but the federal government is using its power to silence voices on campus, to influence what is taught, to influence how schools craft their hiring practices, is really, really profoundly disturbing.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit from your Vassar experience to your professional experience. Of course, they're related. You were
Yep.
editor-in-chief of a paper at Vassar, and of course, have had a long career as a journalist. And before we get into your book, Retribution, which I want to spend the bulk of our time talking about, I do want to just quickly sort of ask for your reflections on your time as a sort of White House, sort of Washington-based journalist who's covered, I believe, 5 presidents over the course of your career. Is that right? 5? Yeah.
Yeah, I was adding it up. I've actually asked questions of 7 different presidents because I had a chance to do I did a group interview with Jimmy Carter way back in
Okay.
the early 1990s. After he was president, to be clear.
Sure.
And then another time at Plains at the Carter at the Carter Center. I got a chance to ask him questions once again. And as a student, I visited the White House with a group of student journalists and had a chance to another kind of a group interview context with George Herbert Walker Bush. So if you add those
Okay.
two, you get to seven.
You get to
Seven
7. Okay.
presidents.
So
Yeah,
5/7.
yeah.
And I've heard you say that,
Yeah.
among other things, one of the things that sort of unites them all is they all feel the media and the press have been unfairly and unnecessarily
Yes.
harsh towards
Yes.
them. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, though, that aside, what are some of the through lines that I think people like you are uniquely able to identify among these 5 to 7 individuals who have held a special place in American history?
Look, I think that every single president that I've encountered, and in my study of American history, this applies going back to um, certainly to John Adams. I'm not so sure it necessarily applies to Washington, but it goes back a long ways. The idea that the press focuses on the negative, that the press misses the big story, that reporters, in Teddy Roosevelt's formulation, were muckrakers. And if you read his speech where he first coined that term, he talks about the man with the muck rake, and he's referring to investigative journalists, always looking down and raking the debris down low and never looking up and seeing what great creations are being made. That was Teddy Roosevelt, a great advocate of freedom of speech, don't get me wrong, freedom of the press, complaining, loudly that the most famous and successful investigative journalists of his time were totally missing the great things that he was accomplishing, and out nitpicking on the negative. Thomas Jefferson uh, famously said, if I were given a choice to live in a society without government or a society without newspapers, I would, live in the former. I'd rather live in a place that had newspapers. But Jefferson himself, later in his life, said nothing can be believed that is written in a newspaper. I mean, he was very bitter. Now, of course, The newspapers of his time were partisan papers.
Sure.
The idea of kind of an objective or a press that strives for objectivity is something that didn't really exist, for another 100 years or so. But my point is that they all uh,
All feel this way.
they all feel aggrieved to some extent, and sometimes some of the criticism is right. I mean, I remember Obama, who I covered for a good 4+ years as the chief White House correspondent for ABC. There were a string of stories that about like the alleged use of the IRS to go after conservative groups, about the Obama administration's aggressive tactics and to go after leaks and to subpoena records from the Associated Press. There was a third story, I forget what it was, but there was this whole series of stories. And Obama called reporters back. Actually, we were called back by his chief of staff, for like, which sometimes happens under all administrations, just for a Friday evening, come back to the chief of staff's office, have a beer or two, and have a talk that is usually off the record. Um, but Obama came back and basically kind of chewed us all out. Like, what are you people doing? You're giving Jay a hard time, referring to his press secretary, Jay Carney. You're asking about stuff that just doesn't matter, and it's a bunch of blah 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 blah. So Obama, who, if you ask any Republican, they'll say this, Obama was given, glowing and uncritical coverage of the press. Not true, by the way. Absolutely not true. But
Right.
if you were to ask Obama about it, the press was entirely unfair to him, and he pioneered something that was done to a degree by his predecessors, but nowhere near the way it's been done since. Going after, talking to alternative media.
Mm.
I remember he did a, big interview with on Between Two Ferns. I don't know if you
No, I'm not
recall that,
familiar.
but it was, at a very critical point. This is like, and Obama, never granted an interview. I remember, and I don't think he even ever called on him at a press conference. Peter Baker, who was the White House correspondent for the New York Times, because again, he was frustrated and unhappy. So anyway, this is Trump is taking everything to a new level. You know, we never had a president call the press the enemy of the people. I mean, Trump's gone to a new level, but
Sure.
the idea of being unhappy with the press is has a storied history in American presidential history.
Nothing new. You mentioned Trump, so let's just pivot to the book Retribution: Donald Trump and the Campaign That Changed America. And there are several things I want to sort of tarry on, if you will, in our conversation about the book. But to start, I would just sort of love to hear from you what your motivation was in writing the book.
Well, my motivation was very simple. I was witnessing what I thought was the most consequential presidential election of my lifetime, and more than that, the most fascinating election. So I made the decision to write the book in the summer of
Right.
2024. So before I knew Trump was going to win, in fact, when I first started considering this, I really didn't think he was going to win again. But I just, this election, given the kind of Shakespearean drama surrounding Joe Biden's decision to run for re-election, and the party, belatedly and reluctantly regretting that decision. Kamala Harris's meteoric rise over the course of, just a few weeks.
Right.
Um, and of course, the idea of Donald Trump campaigning in an election where he would either face the very realistic possibility of going to prison
Right.
or become arguably the most powerful president of our lifetimes, thanks to a Supreme Court that had issued an immunity decision. So I just said, with all of these through lines, I'm reporting on it every day.
Yeah.
My work as a daily reporter is what, that's my day job. That's what pays the bills. That's what I've always done. But I wanted to document this, and for history, and that's why I wrote the book.
It's a perfect primer. And I was chuckling earlier when you described it as a Shakespearean drama because one of the first things that jumped out to me when I read the book was I sort of wrote on my notes just the cast of characters, not only in the story, but in particular the cast of characters you are in direct contact with often
Yeah.
throughout throughout this whole saga, right? And I wrote, I'm going to read some of the cast of characters in a second, but I wrote under that it's sort of like a Greek tragedy slash comedy, right? Because that's sort of how it sort of plays out. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're the chorus, I don't know what role you're playing, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's sort of how I interpreted it. But to sort of give those who've not read the book yet sort of a sense of who you are in contact with, at least in the book, the names I
Yeah.
wrote down are Bobby Kennedy, Bill Ackman, Boris Epstein, Tony Fauci, Steve Bannon, and of course we'll get to Trump in a second. But there's so many people who you
Hunter Biden on that
I'm
one.
sorry, Hunter Biden, of course, is the first person I wrote down, actually. Hunter Biden was the most interesting, actually, to me. But it's an interesting sort of network of relationships that you seem to sort of have, but also be active in your day job, but also in the book. And so I guess my first question is, what do you make of all these relationships? Of course, they have lifespans that go beyond the year and a half from when you started writing the book until now. But what do you make of the fact that you have a life and a career that sort of includes just being in regular conversation with these kinds of people?
I'm so glad that you zeroed in on this because um, it's it's almost surreal, and I don't really know what to make at it, but I make of it, but I try to grapple with it in the book. One person who has had a chance to read the book early said to me that Hunter Biden and Steve Bannon are kind of like the chorus to your
Okay.
story as it goes
Okay.
on. Because I was talking to them, and they, I mean, you can't imagine two more different human beings.
Right.
I was talking to them constantly throughout the campaign in real time, and then when it was all over, I sat down with both of them, as I did with many other people, for an in-depth look back at everything on the record. And you just don't see a lot of this. People, so much, and journalism is I'm anonymous sources are important. Okay. So I'm not going to be one of those, well, don't trust anonymous sources. I mean, if Woodward and Bernstein weren't talking to anonymous sources, and other great reporters of that era, would we have gotten to the bottom of Watergate? Anonymous sources are important, but I really strove to get people to talk to me on the record and in real time. And um, one of the things about this, you often hear this critique. I hear it every time I write a book. How do you save this for the book? And why didn't you report it at the
Right.
time and all that? Well, it's an entirely misconception of how this all works. When I've broken news in my books, and I've broken a lot of news in the previous books, and this book breaks a lot of news, as you know,
Mhm.
um, it's not that I've held something back. I've broken the news because I'm writing a book. I can get people to talk to me, um, knowing that it's kind of that this is written for history.
Right.
And a lot of those conversations that I had, not all of them, but a lot of conversations I had are kind of, embargoed. Nancy Pelosi is another one.
Hmm.
Um, Very long, detailed conversation with her and I talked to her a few times, but one in particular in her office in the middle of the fall campaign. So we don't know who's going to win,
Right.
but I wanted to get her before we knew the result to go back and talk about her role in in getting Joe Biden to get out of the race. She would not have had that conversation with me, and it would have been if she had, it would have been a very different conversation
Sure.
if I'd said, I'm coming to interview you for today's newscast.
Right.
But this is like a step back, and I said, I'm not going to use any of this until after we know who the winner is.
Yeah. One
Uh,
question, just one question about that in particular example. So, what is your sense of how these subjects, if you will, um, approach the conversation from a standpoint of authenticity or not, if they know it is for sort of this different sort of historical purpose, right? There's sort of an awareness, right, that
yeah.
like this is on the record in a different sort of way than sort of a fleeting news sort of segment, right? And so I'm curious if you ever felt like, okay, they're being honest and they're being honest with the framing that is particularly whatever charitable towards them or others, or sort of optimistically framed because they know that this is sort of perceived as sort of an entry into history.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be aware that anybody who's talking to you for a book is in their own way trying to craft how they're going to be seen, really ultimately for history. So you have to keep that in mind and with every conversation. But what I find in these conversations, in part also because they're so much longer, generally, um, and they don't have to worry about how what they say is going to be immediately perceived, that the
Right.
guard is let down in a way. I've seen this with all of the books. Particularly Betrayal, which is the book I wrote about January 6th and the events of the of 2020. And I went back and talked to so many of the key players in the Trump administration. I talked to them in that case after the fact, after Trump had left office. And by the way, most of them never conceived of the idea that he would ever come back to power. So they were
Yeah.
particularly open.
Right.
I think that book lives today in a way that is really valuable because I took at the moment, let's get this down again for history. A lot of those
Yeah.
people will never talk again in that way. I mean, Bill Barr,
Yeah.
I had, you know, one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever had with Bill Barr. It was the first time he spoke to a reporter in any significant way after the 2020 election. And I sat down with him in his study at his house, and he just opened up. Now, Bill Barr, I mean, have you heard much from him lately? I mean, a lot of these people, Trump's back, and it's like they're afraid
Hiding somewhere.
to speak out.
Yeah.
But the other thing, and I'm sorry to, but you keyed in on the relationships. I have, as a reporter, developed relationships with people who would never speak to each other, you know, and they've confided in me, and they feel they can trust me. I'm not going to treat them unfairly. I'm going to accurately represent what they're saying. Um, and I think it's hard to, I mean, Bobby Kennedy is a guy who I've known for, my God, I've known him for like 30
You said
years.
30 years in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And as you saw in those conversations, he gets really angry at me. Like he's blaming me for what he sees as the ills of the quote media, and he's going off on me. But he's
Yeah.
also given me information and insight into who he is
Right.
and to what he's all about. I mean, one of the surreal moments that I tried to portray in the book is I call Bobby Kennedy. I'll never forget the time because it was Halloween. So it's just days before the election.
Yeah.
And it's like early evening. I'm actually working from home. I'm gonna have trick-or-treaters coming in. But one of my colleagues is breaking a story about something related to what Kennedy is preparing to do if Trump wins. And they want my help. So I call him to confirm the story, and he
Oh, yeah.
confirms it. We have a little bit of a conversation. And he starts to berate me a little bit, but I need to get off the phone. I got the trick-or-treaters coming in. I got to get my colleague the thing, and it's, and I'm like, I say, well, so I don't like debate him. There's no reason to. So I just say, well, Bobby, I can just say, whatever happens next week, half the country or nearly half the country is going
Oh,
to
right.
be
Yes.
jubilant, and half the country is going to feel absolutely distraught. And I just hope it's going to work out. Kind of a whatever.
A
So
nice,
I hang up.
polite try. Yeah.
He calls me back. He calls me back a few minutes later and just goes off on me about, well, you said, half the country is going to be upset or half. Well, that's because of you. That's because of you. And he doesn't really mean me personally, I don't think, but
Yeah.
you people have called Donald Trump Hitler. You've called Kamala Harris the second coming of Christ. And he goes on and on and on. And I'm like,
Yeah.
first of all, Bobby, I didn't call Donald Trump Hitler. And I didn't call Kamala Harris the second coming. So by the way,
Right.
let's just be accurate. That never happened, and nobody at ABC did that. So,
Right.
but he told me what people don't understand about Donald Trump is that he's surrounded by really good people who embody who embody the values
Mm,
that my family had when I was growing up. His family, his uncle John F. Kennedy, his father Robert F. Kennedy, his, all that. And he's telling me this, and then I later learn within that evening, he's about to go out on stage in Arizona,
right.
and he's going on stage with Tucker Carlson. So he's telling me that Tucker Carlson represents the values of
Yeah.
Kennedy family. I'm like,
My
um,
God. Well, I think I also heard you or read that you wrote that either he said or you intuited that the real sort of driving factor behind, at least in this case, Bobby Kennedy, was that Tucker Carlson types or Donald Trump himself just sort of gave space for Bobby in a way that others hadn't, right? He had been sort of written off by who he previously thought were his peers or allies or whatever, not listened to at all. And just sort of the fact of being heard and seen, if you will, by folks who we would have thought, were just not aligned with him, made him feel so aligned. Maybe that helped him see the sort of values that he saw in his family in them in ways he wouldn't have seen before because they saw him.
it's
Which,
it's it's absolutely true, and it's such I think, an underappreciated part of this whole saga. Look, the
yeah,
Bobby Kennedy endorsement of Donald Trump, endorsements generally don't matter. They get, so, whatever. People don't really vote based on who endorsed, but there were
right.
two endorsements that really mattered in this race, and one was Elon Musk because it came with
Yeah,
$288 million. Okay, and the other was Bobby Kennedy. I mean, that was a breakthrough moment that member of the Kennedy family. I mean, of course, he's got all these controversial views, and
sure.
he's basically disowned by many of his cousins and all of that. But that was a significant breakthrough moment. And Bobby Kennedy first started to run for president as a Democrat,
Sure.
and he was completely iced out in any way. The Democratic National Committee, made it very clear from the start there would be no debates. That there would be they fought every effort that he had to get on the ballot in any state. They went state by state, fighting him with lawyers. And as it, you know, I mean, even after that, even after he becomes an independent, he tried to reach out to speak to somebody on Kamala Harris's team.
Right.
They made it very clear, nothing. So I spoke to one of Bobby Kennedy's very good and long-standing friends, a fellow environmental activist, somebody who is still very much a Democrat, but likes his friend Bobby Kennedy, who intervened in a way with the Biden White House and tried to get somebody,
Yeah.
reached
Talk
out
to
to,
him.
yeah, just give him a call. Give him a
Yeah.
call. Hear him out.
Yeah.
You know, you don't even, don't give him a primetime spot at the convention. You don't have to do that, but hear him out. And he
Right.
never could get any contact whatsoever. And that like drove him into the arms of Trump.
Yeah.
Now, there were other factors, and
Sure.
it happened anyway. But there is kind of a very personal story there as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems also if we zoom out to sort of society in general, I'll speak for myself. I mean, one would imagine that this story illustrates sort of the value of sort of or the limitations of a cancel culture or icing out or stonewalling
Yeah.
individuals because it oftentimes can have the negative effect that you don't want it to have, right? Which is people sort of don't listen, they don't learn, they sort of just sort of the pendulum swings aggressively, right? And so I think
Yeah.
this story can be illustrative of that. Just to talk on the cast of characters and the relationships, obviously the person who is sort of the title central to the book and who you talk to a lot is President Trump. And I tried to sort of keep a record in my notes of the various phone calls you all had because they seemed like very sort of magical might be overstating it, but they were important inflection points, right? Or sort of data
Yeah.
points along the way. So tell me if I've missed them, just sort of set the record straight. So what I have is you called him the first time in the book that you call him is right after his assassination attempt in Butler, I think. The next time was that he called you in late August. I believe that's right.
Yeah.
After you had interviewed Senator Cotton on GMA. I think he called you 2 days after that. And then the last time, or the two last times I understand were the Sunday before the election after GMA,
Yeah.
and you called him the day after the election. Is that a right accounting of the phone calls over that period of
Yeah,
time?
there are a few others.
Okay.
I spoke to him the day after his famous visit to McDonald's.
Oh, yes, yes.
Um, and I also spoke to him shortly after John Kelly, his former chief of staff, gave a rather extensive interview with the New York Times and called Trump a fascist,
Got it.
and the other things. And I was going through recently because the audio book, by the way, I incorporate. It's not just me reading.
I was gonna
Uh,
ask, are you the narrator? You're the
I
narrator.
am the narrator, but it's more than that. I play. So instead of reading what Trump said to me, I play the sound. So you hear
Okay.
the phone
Oh,
call.
the actual sound. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
and also you hear from the interviews. So you hear from like some of the Hunter Biden interviews and the Steve Bannon interviews,
Oh, so dynamic.
and Pelosi and some others. You hear the actual, and if I quote a speech, I'll play part of the speech. But so I was going through all of my, all my recordings, and there's one that I don't refer to in the book, but it just made me laugh as I was like, "What is this one?" It's really short. And it's I called Trump. Something momentous was happening. I forget what, but during the midst of the fall campaign. And by the way, sometimes when I would call him, he would say, "Hey, Jonathan, what's up?" Like he's got me on caller ID or something. And other times he would say, "Who's this?"
Who is
So
this?
like, maybe it would depend what mood he was in. So this one, he says like, "Who's this?" And I said, "Mr. President, it's Jonathan Karl." And he says, I'm in the middle of something. I just finished an interview, and I'll call you back in an hour." It's just so funny. In the middle of the thing, he's going to call me back in an hour. By the way, I think in that case, that might have been one of those like 2 weeks.
Okay.
I don't think I got a call back in an hour, um, but look, Trump. Actually, the first call that I made to him of this entire campaign was the call right after Butler.
After Butler, yeah.
And I left him a voicemail message because he did not pick up. I didn't expect him to pick up. I just wanted to say, horrified by what happened,
Sure.
hope you're all right. He called me back in that case the next day while his convention was opening up. I mean, literally, like he called me like maybe it was like 30 minutes after he had announced JD Vance as his running mate. And we spoke for like, it was almost 15 minutes long in the midst of like all that's going on. He's just been shot, his convention starting. He's just
Yeah.
done, and he's talking. But what I found over the course of the campaign um, is that he almost always picked up the phone. Now I try not to abuse it, although it got to a point where I would call every couple of days, sometimes very short conversations, sometimes
Right.
longer ones. He would pick up, I would say, 75% of the time. He would just answer the phone.
Well,
If
can
I
I can I pause
called,
you? And can I pause you for a second, actually?
yeah,
Because something I want, and you can incorporate this in your answer in your
yeah,
story. Something that I wrote down as a note that I wanted to sort of discuss was why you thought he answered your calls, why he picked them up. Because, and that's not because I'm trying to discredit you, obviously, but it's not an
yeah.
insignificant thing that the president would
No,
80% of the time pick up your phone
it's
call. So why do you think that was?
first of all, let me just tell you,
Yeah,
we mentioned the seven presidents, right?
yeah,
Um, I've never called a current or former president, and I mean, I've tried maybe, but I mean, it's never happened except for Trump. I mean, it's not a normal thing that a reporter is calling the president or the former president or a presidential candidate, and the
getting
phone's
an
just being
answer.
answered. It's why does he do it? Um, he spends a large percentage of his time on the phone. Um, and he's constantly, he wants the feedback, he wants the input. And almost every time I called him, I would ask what I wanted to ask. He would ask me questions. What's going on? how you seeing it? What's the, about with the state of the race? Um, I think he just it's the way he operates. He loves I recounted in Front Row at the Trump Show, um, being with him in August, or maybe it's September 1st. It was end of the summer of 2015. So he,
Hmm.
fairly early on, he's been through one debate. He's leading the polls already, and I'm in his office talking to him at Trump Tower, and a call comes in. Actually, a couple calls came in. I mean, one in particular, his secretary, Paul O'Neill's on the phone. So he says to me, as he's about to pick up the phone, he says, uh, "Do you know who Paul O'Neill is? Do you know who that is?" And I'm like, "No." I'm thinking about maybe the baseball player. The Yankees used to have
Sure.
Paul O'Neill, but that I was like, no. So he picks up the phone and says, "Paul, I'm here with Jonathan Carl, ABC, and he can't believe who's calling me. He can't believe you're calling me. He's going crazy. He's like, I can't believe you're calling me." So it turns out that Paul O'Neill is kind of a big deal, and I should have known who he is, but Trump was making that all up. He's the guy, the SEAL who um, claims to be the one that
Oh,
pulled the
I
trigger,
see.
that killed
Yep.
Bin Laden. But I was like momentarily, I was like, wow. So he loves the spectacle. Many of the times that he would take my calls, he would be with other people, and he would
Right.
tell the other people I was calling.
Got it.
So there's I recount one conversation where Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, they're on the plane because he takes calls from the plane. Um, and then there was another one where his son Eric was there with them, and he's always telling people that you know.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, if I had tried to call the deputy press secretary of the Kamala Harris campaign, um, the chances of me getting an immediate pick up the phone and answer would be probably closer to 25%. So it was
Yeah.
three times more likely that Donald Trump would answer the
Yeah.
phone. Or if I tried to call somebody in the Trump campaign's press operations, it was more likely that Trump himself would answer the phone
Self-financed phones.
than
Yeah.
one of his spokespeople. Far
That's so
more likely.
interesting. It's so interesting. One more thing on this, but then I want to move to Butler because it's sort of a central part of the
Yeah.
book in so many ways. I'm just curious. You used the word earlier. You said you didn't try to or didn't want to sort of abuse the relationship on the phone, if you will, being able to call President Trump. And it's funny because as I read the book and was sort of keeping track of these interactions, the truth was that I actually wrote down and entered in the book. I was like, I think Jonathan's in an abusive relationship with President Trump because the phone calls, as you know, you experienced them,
Yeah.
they oscillated so much between sort of, I might describe it as vitriol or
Yep.
frustration towards you. And there are moments where you reported that you felt like he just wanted someone to talk to. And in some ways, you were sort of a resource to him or sort of a calming figure to him. And so the oscillation between those two sort of dynamics, of course, I guess is a regular relationship to some degree, but also to another degree could be sort of, I took it as abusive. And so that's obviously me being a little bit funny, but I am curious if you feel like your access to and relationship to the president and other people for whom you have these relationships with do create this complicated sort of overall relationship where you have access and power potentially, but also with that comes pain, frustration, hurt, all those things. Just talk to me about that
Yeah.
juxtaposition.
Trump has um, lashed out at me publicly in some really vicious ways, and it's not new. He did it recently. I don't know if you saw, but
I did.
he told me you have hate in your heart and suggested that Pam Bondi, the attorney general, might go after me because I have hate in my heart. And then he did another one that same day in the Oval Office where he you know, ranted about how I'm not a wonderful person and you think you're a wonderful person, you're not a wonderful person, you're a terrible reporter, you know it, everybody knows it. Um, and he's also said some of the absolute nicest things about me, publicly and privately. The great Jonathan Carl of ABC News, and he as I'm coming into a room and he he's often talked about. I've written about this in the previous books. This interview I did with him in 2014. Full year, more than a year before he announced he was running for president, and he in his mind, it's like this pivotal interview, and it got great ratings, and I got attacked for doing it, and and you knew I was going to run, and nobody else did. I mean, in fact, in the course of the interview, I said to him, I would be shocked if you ran. So he's kind of created this mythology around this, but he's talked about it a lot, publicly and privately to me. I think that one of the things that is about Trump is he can make you feel like you are the center of the universe. The people around him, the people who visit him, it's a key to his to some of the charisma that has drawn people to him, his supporters that are so, some people say it's cult-like, but it's like this
Sure.
real fervent, admiration for the guy. Because no matter who you are, when you're in the room with Trump, he wants you to feel like you're the big and super important person because, by the way, why else would he be with somebody who isn't big and super important? He's Donald Trump. So it's also a way of like
Self-serving.
self-serving. Um, but he will also, to those very people, especially the people who work for him, he will be biting and brutal and take down in a way. So, a lot of these people have, derive a real significant part of their self-worth from what Donald Trump has granted them, the positions they have given him, the
Yeah.
praise that he has offered them. So then he comes and cuts them down,
Yeah.
and it is just brutal. And yes, I think abusive. Um, Reince Priebus was like unceremoniously fired by Trump as Air Force One was returning from some event. This is in 2017. They landed Joint Base Andrews. And suddenly, like Reince is not going to the White House like everybody else. He's got to like, he's fired. I mean, there's
Yeah.
like on the plane. He's like, and then like, I mean, and it's just, it was just it was an act of cruelty to the guy that was serving as his chief of staff. Maybe he deserved to be fired, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but it was done in a particularly degrading and humiliating way.
Got
Um, and Reince, a couple days later, like sees Trump because he's at some, and Trump's like acting like nothing ever happened. It's how you doing, buddy? What's going on? You're the greatest. Um, so with me, I think it's a slight reversal here.
Okay.
Because I've known Trump since 1994. So I've been around him a lot. I mean, we didn't like hang out for the full 30 years, but I reported on him when I was at the New York Post. I interviewed him even when I was at CNN a long time ago. I did the first interview with him, network interview with him when he was of the 2016 cycle. I've known him for a long time. And he constantly thinks that he's going to win me over. And what I try to explain to him is my job is not to be won over. I'm not for you. I'm not against you. I'm a reporter.
Right.
One like angry text I got from him, he does text sometimes too, was you're back in the wrong side. And I said, as you know, I don't back any side. I just report and I try to do so in a way that's, you know, accurate and balanced. Um, and I think that what drives the ferocity of his attacks on me sometimes is despite the fact that he, you know, reaches out to me, I still do my job. And I'm
Yeah.
not going to go and just praise the dear leader. I'm going to just do my job. I mean, I treat him with respect. He's the president of the United States. But, I'm going to ask the questions, whether they are hard or not. I'm going to ask the questions that need to be asked. I'm going to report, what I see as the truth, and betrayal that was really kind of brutally laid out is that he tried to undermine American democracy. He tried to steal a presidential election and he wouldn't accept loss. So, I've, but every time he kind of brings me back in and then he gets very disappointed that I haven't, you know,
Yeah, you're a project for him, Jonathan.
Yeah, yeah,
He's trying
yeah.
really hard. Let's talk about Butler for a little bit, and then we'll pivot to our last segment. Butler, Pennsylvania, for those who might be unclear, is central both in the campaign but also in the book. Of course, the cover of the book is sort of a still from that moment during the assassination attempt, or the moment right after, I should say, the assassination attempt in Butler. And one of the things that you wrote in the book was that President Trump's effort to sort of fight back his Secret Service when they were trying to take him away in a moment that sort of produced this picture was both sort of a dangerous breach of protocol, but also potentially his sort of best moment, most important moment, if you will, of the campaign. And when I read that, it was interesting because I couldn't help but feel like either you or the universe was sort of positing that sort of metaphor is one that applied to this moment in politics, right? That this whole moment could be one large breach of protocol, but also could potentially be sort of the best moment in, American political social history. That's up for debate, obviously. But
Yeah, yeah. I think we're far away from being able to make that
or
assessment. But
or certainly how some people think about it. Maybe it's
yeah,
not
yeah,
the truth, but he might present
yeah.
it.
The way the people around Trump and the way his supporters
Correct.
conceive of it, it's the system has been profoundly broken.
In a positive way.
Only coming in, what Trump has inherited something that wasn't working,
Right.
and the only way to remedy that is to break what's been broken, to completely destroy it, and to begin anew. To be, I guess what his tech friends would say would be the ultimate disruptor,
Disruptor, yeah. So,
disrupting the way things are.
and so just focusing on Butler for a second, talk to us about your decision to sort of localize the biggest inflection point of the campaign on Butler, and what that means, what it meant for you, if you will.
Well, first of all, I came across a treasure trove of information that was publicly available, but nobody had really gone through it. And that is raw interviews with largely the Secret Service agents that were on the ground in Butler, also some of the local law enforcement, to help me reconstruct the kind of minute by minute by minute of what happened. I also went back and obviously spoke to people that were there. My colleague, Rachel Scott,
Mm.
uh, my colleagues, Rachel Scott, Leila Ipsa, Ben Siegel, ABC, were on the ground. Um, I spoke to each of them about what they went through and what they witnessed. I spoke to others who were there. In real time, I spoke to Dave McCormick, who was on the stage with Trump, right, and was Trump was about to call him up to the podium, to the lectern, and then said, "No, we'll do that later," and shots rang out. I reconstructed the story of the shooter, and also uh, of Corey Comparator, who was killed. And it's a it's a incredibly dramatic moment, obviously, in American history. That those immediate minutes after the shots rang out, when the Secret Service agents jump on him, bring him down, he famously loses his shoes in the process. Um, they don't know if there's a second shooter. They get word that a shooter has been eliminated, has been taken down. Crooks, turns out. Um, but the Secret Service agents don't know if there's anybody else. But protocol is they've got to get him into the limo, which they've pulled right up to the stage. Not limo. He's in an SUV. He's not president yet. It's in the armored SUV, and get him to a hospital,
Yeah.
and get him out of harm's way. So they get in position and they're preparing to rush him hunched down into the vehicle, and that's when he fights them off. And one of those Secret Service agents in the picture, um, this guy right here,
Yep.
this guy spoke so vividly about how, they were trying to keep him down, keep him from being exposed, and how he fought against them. And he comes up and he has that moment, fight, fight, fight. I mean, that is an incredibly dangerous thing. He's now exposed to a place where there could be a shooter, another shooter. I mean, it's the last thing that the Secret Service is allowed to let happen. But through the force of whatever, you know, he does it. Maybe it's his, you know, sense of stagecraft, and he knows that that's what he wants to do. He gets in. They take him on the short drive to the hospital in Butler. By the way, one thing I found out that I did not know at the time, nobody knew at the time, was as they were speeding away, one of the houses in Butler they passed was somebody was setting off fireworks, and they
Oh,
fired
right.
fireworks at in the direction of the motorcade, and the fireworks fill. They can smell the gunpowder or whatever is setting off the fireworks as they're going by, and the agents say that they thought they were under attack again.
Yeah, that something else is happening.
Yeah, like this was part of a coordinated,
Attack,
but
yeah.
he gets to the hospital in Butler, and as he's brought in, um, he sees he only had a handful of staff with him. It was Stephen Chung, it was Susie Wiles, it was Walt Nauta, who always carries the bag with him, who was co-indicted
The
with
bag
him
of
in
makeup, right?
yeah, uh, Dan Scavino, and he says to them, "How's it playing on TV? How are the pictures?" I mean, it's like even in this moment where he's like almost been killed, it's
Yeah.
like, what's it looking like? I mean, he knew in the midst of that chaos that that was going to be the defining moment of his campaign and, maybe his life.
Goodness. We're short on time, so I just want to ask one thing before these hot seat questions. Towards the end of the book, you sort of reflect that you, after all of this, sort of reporting on the campaign, the sort of the cabinet selections right after the inauguration, you sort of report at the end that you reflect at the end, rather, that you think some of the concerns about Trump being America's first dictator are overblown, or maybe sort of overstated. And I think it's a potentially not controversial, but a worthwhile assessment because I think that's top of mind for many people. The F word is often used. And so I'm just curious today. It's been maybe a few months since you've
Yeah.
finished the book. Life changes quickly. I would love for you to reflect on that reflection, and just sort of cue us into some of your thinking about this very topical question.
I mean, and I'm going to try to, while I'm talking to you, pull out, unless you have it handy, exactly what I said in those
Yeah,
words, because um, um,
I have it. You
so
want me to read it? Oh, you
yeah,
thought
do
of
you
it?
have it? Do you have it handy?
Yeah, I do. I have it.
Yeah,
Yep. It's
go
on
ahead. Read the.
it's 391. I've long believed and still hope that those, oh, sorry, let me start off. The spectacle surrounding Trump's speech at Fort Bragg was particularly unnerving to people who feared that Trump's return to power posed a threat to democracy and that he could become America's first dictator. I have long believed and still hope that those fears are overblown. Trump has always seemed to me to be more interested in the fame and glory and the love of the crowd than in absolute power. But even if he does care more in the end about public adulation than dictatorial power, Trump has set a series of precedents and has provided a roadmap for a future leader with more sinister ambitions. Trump may not topple American democracy, but he has shown how it can be done.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that the key word in that the first part of what you read is hope. I've long believed and still hope. Um, uh, but I think that the end of that is the critical thing, which is we have seen, and I wrote that, as you said, the nature of books, you have to stop writing and let them print the book, so there's a time lapse. So it's even before some of the events of the last couple of months, that he has set the precedents to destroy American democracy, and shown how it can be done, even if he isn't going to go all the way. I mean, he has still said, and largely has, um, you know, abided by court rulings that have gone against him. There are people around him who have made the case that he has the power of the unitary executive, that he can blow off those court rulings. As J.D. Vance himself, and I wrote about this, said during the campaign, quoting something that supposedly Andrew Jackson said, Justice John Marshall has made his ruling. Now let him send his army to enforce it. There is a belief in some of the people that are helping Trump do what he is doing now, that he truly is above the law.
Yeah.
Will Trump take those steps? He went very far in that direction on January 6th in, pressuring his vice president to do something that was blatantly unconstitutional and illegal,
Yeah.
and to overturn the election. In the end, he did walk out of the White House. He did leave, but man, it didn't
Pretty
always
close.
look like that was going to happen. So, look, it's a perilous time. The other theme of particularly the end of the book is that Trump's second term is far more consequential than his first term already. The first term, there was a lot of chaos, there was a lot of outrage, and it kind of was ephemeral, and it basically went away, when a new president was elected. But what he's doing now is having a much more profound impact on the way our government works, on culturally, on the country, on the psyche of the country. So look, this is the title of the book is Retribution. Uh, I I called it that because that was what I believe his campaign was about, and it is a driving force behind, if not all, much of what he is doing as president. Um, and I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know where it's going to go. Yes, I still do, believe that Trump himself isn't so much doesn't want the dictatorial to be, ruler for life and all of that. But you know, he's doing a lot to undermine the checks and balances that would limit what a president can do.
Yeah. With that, let me just pivot to our last three student hot seat questions, and we'll get you out of here. First question is one word to describe the culture of Washington.
Broken. That's
There we go. Number two, what rituals do you have, if any, as a journalist? Anything that you do sort of for good luck or sort of routine as you're interviewing someone or going on a big project? Anything that's a ritual that you employ?
obsessively reading. I'll just say that one of the things is I do still get actual print newspapers delivered to my house every day and dive into those. Although sometimes I'm overtaken by events and I'm reading mostly online, but I still cling to newsprint. Even if I don't always,
Read it.
yeah.
Have it. Last question is, if you had one message to give to aspiring or young journalists, what would it be?
Strive to understand people who you may disagree with. Understand that a reporter's job is look, and there's great political opinion journalism. So I'm talking about stuff that I do. Understand that a reporter's job is to seek the truth and truly not to take sides.
Jonathan, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. It was such a pleasure reading your book. Congratulations on another one out. And it's just been a pleasure having you on the podcast today.
Thank you. It was a great to talk to you and go Brewers. All right.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for tuning in for another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.